Okay, Laura's asked me to represent our group to kick off this discussion, and I want to start by saying that at least my group was successful in following Laura's instructions. We had fishermen, regulators, academics. Am I missing anyone in our group? So I think it was a really good cross section, and because of that, we had a nice diverse input. And we started out by identifying 10 or so as we thought we should. And then what we did is we eliminated ones we thought didn't quite rise to the bar, and then we picked several that did. Again, keeping in mind that this was supposed to be about management, not about the other three sessions. What we did is we kind of combined our 3 or 4 top ones into 2. The ones that rose to the top were user groups and access to a resource, particularly if seeding became something we did, or collecting spat and moving it. Who pays and who owns that resource, we kind of circled back and combined into this user group and ownership. And then our second main category was, how do we go about moving scallops? If either collecting seed or moving sub-adults became a model, what would that look like? And if anyone from the group wants to jump in and either correct what I'm talking about or expand what I'm talking about in case I'm misinterpreting it, that'd be great. So in our ownership funding category of kind of defining some management goals, the main topic was, well, who's going to pay for any of this, whether it's seed collection, whether it's, we decided not to talk too much about hatchery because we thought that would be a totally different venture, or moving scallops, who's going to pay for that? And we decided in the short term as a research scale project that RSA funding might be appropriate for that. However, we thought in the long term that RSA funding would not be appropriate for that. And that got us to thinking about, well, how does this work short term versus long term? Someone else brought up that there may be mitigation funding from wind power, and that this might be a good place to spend that as opposed to buying out the fishery and putting fishermen out of work. Perhaps using wind power mitigation to pay for spat collection and moving of scallops. Short term, again, maybe some R&D money, either from grants, RSA, wind, academic funding, university funding, places like Coonamessett that seek out university and academic funding and then use it for projects that they deem as important. So that would be another potential source. And then in long term, maybe a percentage of the fishery funding being returned to seed collection, either in the terms of dollars being returned or in collected seed being returned as a common resource. We thought that maybe somehow there could be some federal funding in a form of a subsidy to support collecting seed. But then that comes down to, if we have all these different sources paying for access to seed, how do we regulate who owns the seed? Is it the fishery? Is it a common resource? Is it owned by who collects it? We kind of figured in a lot of our discussions over the last 2 days that what we've seen in France and Japan as the co-op model probably would not work in a federally managed fishery with a lot of fishermen and a lot of companies owning stakes in it. Then does it become a public resource? If someone collects seed and puts it back down in the bottom, does everyone have equal shot at it? And who decides that? So I think that's kind of where we landed on this whole, who pays for seed collecting? And again, this would have to, kind of the other bigger picture, we decided that even if this is managed regionally and even if there's several different models developed, there needs to be kind of one entity in charge of moving the chess pieces around. You know, one fishing company can't say, well, I'm going to take spat collected from here and move it to here. Another guy can't say, well, I think maybe it should be from here to there. There needs to be a game plan a scheme that someone develops, and that scheme needs to be flexible, depending on what we learn as we go through this. And then we thought, if we're talking about moving seed around, there's probably going to be some mechanisms to talk about when it comes to moving live animals across a very large geographic area. That's not something you can do trivially. So would there be permits required to move either seed-sized animals or subadults from one place to another? If there were permits required, who would issue those permits? Who would monitor them? Who would make sure that they're carried out correctly? Would that be a NOAA job, an Army Corps job, a council job? Maybe everybody, hopefully not everybody, because we know where that leads. And then we decided that if we are going to move particularly subadult animals around, there needs to be some established best practices. And thinking about mortality, regulatory, specifically thinking about disease control. When does it happen? Who decides from what place to what place adult animals get moved or subadult animals get moved? Is this a role where we can establish spawner sanctuaries? And again, if we establish a spawner sanctuary, someone's got to say, this is going to be a spawner sanctuary for the next 3 years. No one fishes there. The seed is a public resource that's collected. However the rules need to be made, again, we need to decide who that's going to be. And we also thought if we're going to move animals around, we need somehow to monitor the success of that. Is it working? And if it's not working, how adaptive do we need to be to change our practices to make it work? And then I think, again, kind of going back to this, there needs to be a grand scheme for this. Who's responsible for the moving? Is this something the fishery does itself? Is this something that contract boats are hired to do? Is this something that a company develops themselves and presents themselves as the seed company that moves animals around and fishermen pay that, or the government pays that? And I think we kind of ran out of time there. And we also talked a little about predator control. If you're going to pick a place as a sanctuary or pick a place as a seed repository, does it make sense to go in there and get rid of the starfish first? Does it make sense to let the crab fishermen have access to the site and kind of denude it a little bit so that's a better place to receive seed and maybe have success? And if anyone from my group wants to chime in, or anyone from the audience have thoughts, if Laura's going to let us go rogue a little bit. I know we've got 5 more to do, so I better sit down.
All right, thank you. You all covered a lot, and clearly had some really thoughtful, good questions. A lot of good questions. Bobby, do you want to report out from your group, or is someone else going to report out? Carl, awesome.
I'm Carl Hensberger, State of Maine scallop biologist. So we had a lot of good discussion. When we started talking about the issues, a lot of them seem to be interwoven, and we talked about money and time, and time with the changing research goals, the time it takes for research to happen, the time it takes for regulation to happen, and the need for the industry for things to happen in a timely manner. But the issues we really kind of focused in on were the need for the consensus of an objective, how to identify the spatial scale of the enhancement, and the diversity of what you're planning to enhance with, be it just, hatchery raised scallops or wild collected. And we also wanted to talk a little bit about the challenges of hatcheries and the technical aspects there. Starting with the spatial I guess we didn't have time to talk about the spatial scale. Starting with the objectives, the goal is kind of having that steady supply of harvestable scallops, obviously, but that is very spatially specific on what the bottlenecks are for each different unique bed or new bed. You know, some beds, we don't know if they are spat limited or if the scallops are have high mortality at different life stages. So there's, you know, the understanding of what would need to happen on each bed. But we think in order to help with this process, we need to kind of think broadly and start at the scale of, you know, what would be the most challenging aspects so we can start thinking about what hurdles we need to overcome. And the there's, you know, the interstate cooperation, the council's responsibility, industry collaboratives, and international with the resource being shared along the Canadian line. Who owns it, who's responsible, and there needs to be communication between everybody. And kind of another thing we talked about is it all depends on what the ideal source of the enhanced the seed is. Is it going to be a wild collected seed, a hatchery collected seed, or transplanting scallops? And they all have their unique challenges. And then and then we focused in on what's needed at the hatchery level. One of the big things was obviously funding, and we mentioned in our group that we thought it was important to have the funding be either nonprofit or universities to avoid the trade secrets in the hatchery level. So it's not a single company with you know, the trade secret challenges. And the hatcheries in other well, and oysters definitely have shown the ability to scale up well, but there's definitely the challenges of funding, the capitalization for the hatchery. For it to be successful at the larger spatial scale, it was suggested that it would have to be like a scallop-only hatchery because of all the unique challenges that we talked about earlier. But we did think that it was like talking about the timing, that it made sense for the hatchery discussions to continue along with the other discussions and hatchery work moving forward with the understanding that it would likely be 10 to 15 years until a hatchery would be at that level where it could produce a product. And hopefully at that time, there would be a framework in place that could help discuss the questions that the previous group was just talking about. And the framework for addressing all of these questions is, I think, an important step. And any other thoughts from the group?
Thank you, Carl. Great job. Travis, who are you going to report out for your group? Pass the mic.
Thank you. So we're flipping the room around here. We talked about a lot of different things. It could be issues, existing federal laws and regulations, the scope of things, competing marine users, how to do the assessment with enhanced scallops versus wild scallops, scaling, market research, transport, permitting. But ultimately, we landed on three issues we thought were the most important. The first was funding and ownership, not ownership and funding like the first group. So we had a lot of similar ideas. In the short term, we really thought about research. We need to do funding research, and we wanted to make sure we looked beyond just the RSA. The RSA is obviously a potential avenue for funding this, but we noted that there was a lot of RSA already dedicated to surveys, and that we don't really see the RSA getting a whole lot bigger in the short term. So we wanted to look at other sources, Sea Grant, potentially using offshore wind funds for offsetting impacts. SK, we think it falls into a lot of the priorities of these other funding sources. And moving forward in the short term, we thought there need to be some more outreach and letting sort of industry and other interested parties know about this effort. Right now, there's a lot of advocates in the room here, but I think beyond this room, there's probably not a ton. And so getting out there that this effort's going on and letting folks know that the things we're striving for and our goals, we thought would be very important. And we thought you could also do that through other advocacy groups. So not just the council or NIMS, but other groups. And we really thought too, the council just developed a climate ecosystem steering committee. I'm not sure I said that right, but that was a potential group that could have some say in the way that this operates, because we see it as really helping the scallop fishery become sort of climate resilient. In longer term, we talked about this being industry funded, which was discussed, doing it through a set aside. We also talked about an option of having individual buy-in. Who wants to help support this? And that creates an extra sort of wrinkle, and then you have to determine who's going to land the enhanced scallops and who's going to land the other scallops. But we thought that process could be developed. We also talked something about a little bit different, as in a cost recovery program. So instead of using landings to offset the costs of the operations, you could have sort of like a tax on all landings that you would pay, and that could fund the operation. And we also thought about maybe some sources of state funding. We had a very interesting idea about using the BREP program, the bycatch reduction program, to remove all the sea stars, so then you wouldn't have bycatch because they're gone. So I thought that was a really cool way of thinking. Moving forward, and to keep this conversation going, we thought a lot of this would probably be worked out in the council's action. We're gonna have to figure these things out in the development of an action. So we thought a lot of that would be taken care of then. But we also thought about having additional groups, outreach groups, advocacy groups, news articles about this effort to keep the momentum going. The second thing we landed on as being really important was for areas, both areas that we should be studying, and then ultimately the areas that we're going to enhance. And one of the ideas for studying areas was to sort of use existing closed areas that we already have. So we know that scallops can be in these areas, so why not use those areas as potential sites to research? We talked about utilizing the observer program and potentially discussing whether we could add additional fields for them to collect, to give us maybe more nuanced information that might be necessary. And we talked about getting some real-time industry input. One of the things we had some concerns too, we don't really have a way of how are we going to identify the enhanced scallops versus the wild scallops, particularly if this thing scales. And so, and if you're doing them in areas where there's potential mixing of the two different types of scallops. Another thing that was brought up that we really wanted to consider is monitoring and enforcement of the areas. Sometimes we draw really little boxes in the ocean, and they can be difficult to enforce, to keep people out of. So we really want to make sure we draw areas that can easily be, we can enforce the fishing in the area and the closure of the area. and have ways to monitor the scallops in there. We thought a lot of this work could be done through the PDT. We also thought of when we did select an area to consider, that there could be a sort of smaller groups of researchers that were area specific in these dedicated enhancement areas that could convene and talk about their experience and different things that happened in that area. And we really thought it would be important to probably have an annual enhancement summit. So sort of keep the ball rolling, give people assignments, have follow-up on what they did, what they've done, where we are. And so to gather a similar sort of group of people annually with that on everyone's calendar, so you know that's coming, people have deadlines, we're striving to achieve specific goals. And we thought a lot of this could maybe be done too through a separate enhancement working group, separate from the PDT, separate from the committee, but a separate group that is strictly focused on enhancement. We thought when we're talking about these areas and the gear we're using, we probably should engage the marine mammal people sooner rather than later. And we also talked about how we could maybe use some of the existing data that's out there to model which areas might be best for enhancement. Moving forward, again, we thought the council process and research institutions could help push this forward. And the last thing we talked about was measuring success. And we separated that in long and short term. In the short term, can we grow them? Are they surviving? We thought that was really important, and that would really show success. Just locking down funding for research we saw as a success in the short term. We really thought, based on like sort of Bobby's presentation, we thought we needed a full economic assessment of this. And it seems like similar work has been done by Andrew at VIMS. And so Dave, you're on the hook for that. And we thought too, if we really wanted to push this forward, we needed to strive to get industry buy-in. And we really wanted, although that's a short-term goal, we wanted long-term industry buy-in. There's a lot of enthusiasm behind this now because the stock is down. But the real goal of this is to sort of have consistency and have more consistent landings and revenue. And to do that, you need to have a long-term outlook on this thing, even when times are good, from the wild side. Long-term, we wanted more consistency in landings. And that doesn't necessarily mean consistency in harvestable biomass. We're probably going to see that go up and down. So we should have a goal of having more consistent landings, and maybe you have to leave some in the water some years in order to keep that consistency from year to year. We wanted to be able to separate in the projected landings the wild and the enhanced scallops. You have to come up with a way to determine which are which. And this was kind of an interesting one. We wanted consistent and increased revenue, not just landings. I mean, what if we put all this work in, we enhance the scallops, and the price crashes? What if the product quality is different? What if the perception from the public isn't the same? And so you've done all this work, and maybe you were successful in your enhancement efforts. People ultimately make less money. And so that needs to be a long-term goal. We need to make at least the same, have consistent revenue or increased revenue. And we wanted to reduce environmental impacts, minimize them to the extent practical. Moving forward, we thought we needed continued economic research, and we thought it was really important to set benchmarks so we have, clear goals about where we want to head. Anybody have anything else?
Give you the clip notes. A lot of overlap with the group that just spoke. I think Travis was listening to some of our discussion. So Just quickly on the list of things that we identified, we talked about goals and objectives by region, thinking about kind of inshore, offshore, but also Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank, funding sources, outreach and engagement with the public, focusing on data gaps and different data needs. So ocean acidification, what are the scallops eating, on permitting and regulatory changes that might be needed. We talked a little bit about focusing on ongoing enhancement process. That was one of our 3, and then on continued research. So I'll just get right into it. For the research needs, we binned this into kind of two parts of the discussion. One was where could the money come from to support research, and then what should that research focus on? And we also said we need research to support the implementation of enhancement at the council level. So there's going to need to be some analysis to make changes in the FMP. So on the money side, we talked about set aside. So we know about the research set aside, ideas of enhancement set aside, but also different prioritization for what are the areas of under the enhancement tent that we would work on. And I'll just say in our group, we really talked a lot about spat collection and grow out. We didn't talk much about transplanting. We didn't talk much about seed rearing. We were really focused on the kind of the spat collection angle. But under the funding sources, we noted there might be some money from offshore wind. Peter said ROSA just got a pile of money. The SK grants, and then a fishery development fund that I think is related to offshore wind that is run through the states. So I think there were some good, pretty tangible ideas there. And we thought this might focus not just on scallops, but on starfish too as well, in addressing that. So for the research focus, spat collection materials, the location, which I think came up a lot, and where you could grow out. Predators, we really like the idea of the fuzzy ropes. Looking at and measuring the impact of natural sets versus enhanced sets, the value of oceanography and what's that would add, not just to enhancement, but also to our current wild fishery. Thinking about the genetic diversity between wild sets, as well as the enhanced stock, the scalability of all of this, density of seeding, disease, so those sorts of things. In terms of kind of our second area of focus, we blended kind of goals and objectives and the permitting regulatory change. We thought that for the regulatory changes, you would want to think about that after you've identified a vision, and those visions might be different by region. I think that was already said, and it might be different for inshore and offshore. We also said that the research and the research results and findings should guide the focus of what you might change in the FMP, and that it's appropriate to start a process to look at change at the council level, but not to get too far ahead of what the research is going to tell us. And so really to think about what the results of the research are, is something feasible, and then try to match that on the regulatory side. In terms of continuing the discussion around enhancement, this was, I think, we spent a lot of time on this at the very end and trying to keep the momentum going around this topic and the interest. So we want our own scallop squad, so maybe we can make that happen. Really thinking about the value of the oceanographic information, not just for the enhancement, but also in the management of the federal fishery. We talked about real-time monitoring and that's ability to inform management. And so I think Connor McManus is here. We mentioned like the AUV, some of the automated annotation, and just ways to leverage technology to get more real-time results from the data that's already been collected. We had an idea to contact the American Clean Power Group that is kind of a clearinghouse for who has which offshore wind lease, and that really trying to think about regional dollars that are available for wind developers. And then this idea of standing facilitated meetings on enhancement, one that would focus kind of on the process. So where are things at the council level? What are the high level kind of state of the research? But then another group that would focus on the specific research questions that are ongoing around the topic of enhancement. And then we identified a list of groups that would be involved in that. So that's what we had for the 3.
Anyone else from the group? We cover it all? Awesome. Standard facilitated meetings to just give me a nice long-term job, Jonathan. All right. Dana,
Yeah, thanks. It's on. Yeah, thanks. And I can be very brief here. I'll look to the others in the group to add on here. We started off talking about location and the science that's needed and recognizing just simply that there's a long runway for this sort of thing. And so if you're going to propose an action, it's going to be a little while. So it makes sense to start sooner rather than later. But that also kind of connoted that if you're going to start something, maybe start something that's sort of bite-sized so that you can have achievable, or a good chance of some achievable success there and to continue to build on a learning opportunity in that regard. And that kind of led into the next recognition that we're talking about both. That one's better? That one's better. Okay. I couldn't tell. It's a recognition of long-term versus short-term goals as others had recognized. And that brought us to the topic of funding, like it has come up in other groups. And I guess the angle that we talked about there was not so much who, but trying to either develop new relationships or approach different agencies specifically with the knowledge that these kinds of experiments take time. And if you're going to be at this table for 5 years or 10 years, maybe it's an all of the above approach where you try SK and the scallop set aside, but those are in and of themselves not the long scale that we need. So there may be some creative thinking needed there. There was a lot of discussion about like the flexibility that happens inshore, meaning within state waters. There's a lot of options there because the regulatory pathways are set and the techniques are relatively well known, whereas offshore it's a much different situation and the options seem to be limited at this point. Now we kind of went into a little bit of discussion about maybe that there are some points of overlap there, but we didn't go too far down that road. And so really trying to think about the division of what's possible offshore for all those technical and biological and regulatory challenges came up. And then the last thing that I'll touch on is that in several instances, the location, which kind of connoted habitat, that there's an opportunity/need for really creative thinking, where maybe there are agencies or groups or organizations that have not been approached before, but which might have expertise or a different angle. And sometimes when you get a new person in the room, for example, you get a set of fresh eyes and you get some fresh background and you get some fresh perspective in there. And so thinking a little bit unconventionally might be useful here. So for example, we were talking about green crabs, not green crabs, we were talking about starfish and trying to find market-based solutions for starfish. And maybe this means that we need to go to other places or other offices or agencies that deal, I don't know, with economic development or what was the other thing? I'm losing a word here, like biochemistry or something like that, to do a little bit of creative thinking about maybe a way to find value in starfish. So the notion of bringing new players to the table came up in a couple of different scenarios. I think I'll stop there and looking around the room for other things that ought to be put into this category, please. Thanks.
all right. Thank you, Dana. And last but not least, our fearless leader, Dave.
Thanks, Laura. As you can see, my handwriting is so bad, I can't even read it myself. So I'll tell you, our group, I think, plowed over the earth that you all have done. You all did a great job and were really comprehensive. And, you know, if you're not first, you're last, I guess. So so I think a lot of what we focused on talking about the regulatory management was what a lot of other folks have talked about. Ownership was a big one. How do you disentangle that from who has invested in in this process and who gets to benefit from it. There was some issues with equitability across the fleet and the participants, and so I don't think we came up with a solution there, but identified that as an issue. One of the things we did spend a bit of time on was this issue of public perception, and that is maybe a little bit unique that other groups maybe didn't spend as much time on, but how does that look to the outside public? I mean, we are all of us here are entrenched in the scallop fishery, and so we have a certain perspective. But folks from the outside might have some issues with enhancement and moving seed from Maine to the Mid-Atlantic, and thinking about how we can do selective breeding, potentially if hatcheries work out. So there's some issues there to be considered should this move forward with how this looks to the outside. Obviously, the conversations all pivoted back to funding, right? Who's going to pay for this? How are we going to pay for this? This is a big effort. And so one of the things we also talked about was an RSA type funding model. There's not a lot of bandwidth in the existing RSA program, and probably not a high ceiling to increase it at this point. But we felt like this was a way to, in some ways, sidestep kind of the ownership. If everybody pays in, then everybody kind of benefits. In addition to the RSA model, we had Sebastian in our group, and we talked a little bit about how offshore wind might be able to play in this space with respect to mitigation efforts or compensation efforts, and there might be an interest there with some of the monies that might be available through that mechanism. So that was another topic area that we found. And then I tried to kind of direct the group back to some of the regulatory issues that might be specific to certain ways of operating an enhancement program. And so I kind of tried to push the group towards thinking about, what about a hatchery-based model? How does that work? What are the regulatory needs there? And you know, biosecurity was a big one. You know, we think about that a lot. I think our pathologist is still back there, and so this is a nod to you. I know that's on your mind all the time. So we think about that in the context of moving seed across state lines or moving animals. Are there other biosecurity issues that need to be talked about? Permitting at the state level, if a hatchery-based model moves forward, because at scale, there's going to need to be a lot more infrastructure to support something like this. In the spat collection model, and obviously we've been talked over the last couple of days that it's probably not going to be one or the other, but it's going to be probably a little bit of both. And so spat collection, certainly vertical lines were an issue depending on the technology that gets developed for that. But are there other ways to collect spat? I mean, obviously there's the tried and true methodologies that work. Are those applicable in the era of right whale entanglement environment? So that was a couple things we talked about there. How we move this forward, that was a big one. And I think we landed on a couple different things. And just to follow on what Jonathan's been saying, I think getting this elevated into the strategic plan of the council is going to be important. That's what gets it on paper. That's what gets it codified and moving forward. But we also thought that some structure is going to be important too, to move this forward. And what that looks like, we weren't exactly sure, but a diverse group of people to champion this and move it forward through process, look for funding, make sure that research, R&D priorities are identified and funded, that we thought was going to be an important aspect of this to move it forward. And so I'm not sure what else. Yeah, we talked a little bit about some of the same funding mechanisms. So an RSA-like mechanism, offshore wind, potentially some federal funding, BOEM, SK, and then the private industry. What's their appetite to contribute? What's their interest and capacity to invest in this process? So I think I'll leave it there. One last thing I'll touch on in terms of the pace. So I think there was some concern about, well, what's the time scale on this? And I said, you know, I think we talked about, well, it depends what you're talking about, how you identify enhancement, what techniques you use. Some might have a shorter runway than others. But we also thought that it was important some attainable goals along the way and have proof of concept type projects that could be executed and move forward to show that, hey, this has some promise, this could work, we can move forward. Where that might be was up to discussion, but obviously from what we've talked about over the last 2 days, some of the cooler regions, probably a candidate Gulf of Maine for this bank. So that was kind of where we left it. It was a quick 35 minutes. We were kind of all over the place, but it was a good discussion, and it really mirrored what the rest of the group found. So thank you.